Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Airbnb is taking sides in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and it's discriminating against Jewish landholders in Judea and Samaria.
Airbnb delisted Jewish vacation homes in the biblical heartland. As Chris Mitchell explains, the one-sided policy has some charging anti-Semitism.
This is Villa Herodian in Tekoa, about 15 minutes south of Jerusalem. Owned by American-Israeli Louis Weinger and his family, it's one of some 200 properties affected by Airbnb's West Bank boycott. The Weingers host events and can sleep up to 14 people in their luxurious home. It has a spectacular view of the Judean hills, and it's listed on Airbnb, but not for long.
I think it's crazy. It just doesn't make any sense that I can't list my property, but Mohammed down the street in Bethlehem can list his property and call it Palestine.
Airbnb operates in 191 countries in 81,000 cities, but it said in a press release, when we applied our decision-making framework, we concluded that we should remove listings in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank that are at the core of the dispute between Israelis and Palestinians.
That's obviously taking a position, a political position that I believe is discriminatory and anti-Semitic.
I think our reaction should be that we could boycott Airbnb. And anybody who cares about Israel, the Jewish people, is willing to fight against anti-Semitism should fight against Airbnb.
Israeli government minister Michael Oren says the Airbnb boycott could be just the beginning.
It sends a signal that not just Jewish companies in Judea and Samaria can be boycotted, but the Jewish state can be boycotted. And we've known throughout history that waves of anti-Semitism, most recently the Nazi anti-Semitism of the 1930s, 1940s, began with a boycott of Jewish goods. This is the way it begins.
Airbnb's policy discriminates grossly against people of the Jewish faith and people of the Jewish ethnicity. They treat Jews living in the West Bank different from any other group.
Professor Eugene Kontrarovich said out of the whole world, Airbnb chose to make a point here.
There is indeed a political dispute about the West Bank, but they're not saying we're not taking listings from the West Bank. They're saying we're not taking listings from Jews in the West Bank. That's not just a double standard, that's naked discrimination.
Weinger's neighbor, Rabbi Eitan Levy, explained the Jewish roots of the area.
Tekoa itself was the home of the prophet Amos. In the 9th chapter of Amos, he says that God will return his people Israel, they will rebuild their conquered cities, they will sink down their roots and never more be uprooted from the land. And right here, you can come to the modern Tekoa, and here we are, we're living out those prophecies today.
For now, Weinger says he doesn't know what impact being unlisted on Airbnb will have on his business. But whatever happens, Levy says God will provide. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, I hope you're as concerned about this as I am. This is something that we need to let Airbnb know how we feel, that if they're going to discriminate against Jewish owners of property, well, that is just unacceptable in our culture today. But there's a rise of anti-Semitism, and you look at Europe, it's absolutely incredible what's going on in that continent, and also here in America. And it's more than the horrific shooting in Pittsburgh. It's more than people painting swastikas on a professor's office wall. It's more than that. Here's something that a Temple University professor said. His name is Mark Lamont Hill, and he spoke at the UN just yesterday. Here's his statement: "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." So here is a professor at Temple University coming out and saying Israel doesn't have a right to exist. That's what that phrase means, a free Palestine from the river to the sea. That's from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. And that has been a rallying cry for the Arabs since 1948. They wouldn't accept the state of Israel. They declared war as soon as the state of Israel declared its existence. There was a peace. Transjordan, what we now call the West Bank, was called Transjordan. Jordan occupied it. And they've been beating that drumbeat ever since. It's been now 70 years of Israel doesn't have a right to exist. And to have that repeated at the UN yesterday, have that applauded at the UN, It just boggles your mind. The rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-Israel statement rhetoric, it's deeply disturbing. Why it's allowed to continue, why people are still allowed to say Israel doesn't have a right to exist, I just don't understand it. There must be a spiritual cause here, and we as Christians, we need to realize now more than ever, stand with Israel. Well, in other news, the media is in a frenzy over reports that the president's former attorney lied to Congress. John Jessup has more from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
Thanks, Gordon. Michael Cohen is now cooperating with special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation after pleading guilty to lying to Congress about a Trump Corporation real estate deal. The question now, will the fallout do damage to the president? CBN News senior Washington correspondent Jennifer Wishon is following the story.
He once said he'd take a bullet for President Trump. Now Michael Cohen is working with Robert Mueller, the man many Americans believe is unfairly targeting the commander-in-chief.
What he's trying to do is get a reduced sentence, so he's lying about a project that everybody knew about.
The president's former attorney says he lied to lawmakers about a proposed Trump real estate project in Moscow. Cohen told them the project was abandoned in January of 2016 before the Republican primary got underway. Now he says project planning continued into June, deep into the presidential campaign. The president says he put a stop to the project because of his run for the White House.
There would be nothing wrong if I did do it. I was running my business while I was campaigning. There was a good chance that I wouldn't have won, in which case I would have gone back into the business. And why should I lose lots of opportunities?
Some fear Cohen's testimony may have put the president in a perjury trap. But Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani says the president's written answers to Mueller about the Moscow project match Cohen's version. The president today tweeting that he was open about his business dealings during the campaign, lightly looked at doing a building somewhere in Russia, put up zero money, zero guarantees, and didn't do the project. Witch hunt. While the mainstream media has had a field day with these latest developments, CBN News chief political analyst David Brody had this take on Faith Nation.
This is a big whopper of a non-story. Non-story. This is about a Trump Tower deal in Moscow that was never a deal, by the way, and Michael Cohen lied to Congress. Okay, that's a problem. But for Donald Trump and collusion, what in the world does this have anything to do with collusion? But if you look at the mainstream media networks, you would think it's the end of the world, that's the smoking gun.
Former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski and former deputy campaign manager Dave Bossie tell CBN News Cohen's lies have nothing to do with the president.
Michael has his own legal issues that he's created. They have nothing to do with the outcome of the election. They had nothing to do with some type of fake Russian collusion story.
Meanwhile, the president canceled a planned meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit, citing ongoing disapproval of Russian aggression in Ukraine. Jennifer Wishon, CBN News, Washington.
Thanks, Jennifer. The Russia-Ukraine conflict could overshadow the G20 meeting in Argentina this weekend. An important item on the president's calendar is a Saturday meeting with his Chinese counterpart. The two plan to discuss a possible agreement on trade negotiations that could lower the temperature in an ongoing trade dispute. This morning, Mr. Trump signed a trade deal with the leaders of Canada and Mexico, replacing the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, the Trump administration is investing $100 million in the global war against HIV and AIDS. It's a continuation of George W. Bush's popular program called PEPFAR. As CBN's White House correspondent Ben Kennedy shows us, the funds will help faith-based and community groups fight the dreaded disease.
Faith-based groups are leading the fight to combat this epidemic with prayers, funding, research, and treatment. Teaming up with the White House here behind me, lawmakers and groups around the world to bring an end to this disease.
Our administration is proud to partner with faith-based organizations across Africa and around the world.
The U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, has helped save more than 16 million lives. PEPFAR began 15 years ago under President George W. Bush, funding treatment for 14 million people. The initiative even helped some 2.2 million babies who were born HIV-free to HIV-positive mothers.
We ought not to allow ourselves to be caught up in the numbers, because we're talking about people. We're talking about real lives.
we are going to win this battle primarily because of the faith in the Lord Jesus Christ.
The Circle of Hope in Zambia teamed up with PEPFAR to help more than 3,000 people this year alone.
We want to reach out wholeheartedly so that they can enjoy a good life and actually experience the hand of God in their lives through PEPFAR.
If you want to end this pandemic, you've got to bring the faith-based community, the churches, especially in Africa.
On Capitol Hill, Congressman Chris Smith introduced a 5-year, $30 billion extension of PEPFAR, which had bipartisan support in the House and just passed the Senate Wednesday.
It could come back with a vengeance unless there's ongoing expansion of best practices to reach the greatest number of people.
And do you feel like with faith-based organizations and with lawmakers like yourself, we could possibly end this epidemic?
I believe that this is doable.
Now, AIDS-related deaths have been cut in half since its peak in 2004, and new HIV infections have declined by nearly 50% because of initiatives like PEPFAR. Ben Kennedy, CBN News, the White House.
Thanks, Ben. A new report says life expectancy in the U.S. is dropping. Suicides and drug overdoses are behind the continuing decline in the number of years Americans are expected to live. The CDC says overall more than 2.8 million people died in the U.S. last year, nearly 70,000 more than in 2016. It is also the most deaths in a single year since the government started collecting those figures more than 100 years ago. Many deaths can be attributed to our country's aging population, but the death rate among younger people and middle-aged people is also up. A big factor is the growing number of drug overdoses. But even more alarming, the suicide death rate in 2017 was the highest in at least 50 years. Regent University's Dr. Corney Becker says the numbers show people are desperate for fulfillment.
The answers out there in the culture is not working for people. We were not created for sin. We were created for holiness. And ultimately, sin will break your heart. It cannot fulfill you. And I think this is indicative of people saying, there's not enough here in this world apart from Christ, apart from God, that can fulfill me.
And Gordon, Dr. Becker also said the report should cause the church to re-examine its message to today's culture.
I think it should cause us to preach the gospel even more. It reminds me of what Peter wrote so long ago. This is 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 19. They promise freedom, but they themselves are slaves of sin and corruption. For you are a slave to whatever controls you. When you look at the current opiate epidemic in our country, it's literally controlling people, and they don't see a way out. They don't see a hope, a future. They don't understand that there is a God. And without God, you are without hope. He's got a hope and a future for you. You just have to grab hold of that and leave these other things behind. If you're a slave to anything, any kind of compulsion that's controlling you, please get free from it. And the only way you find freedom, the only true freedom, is in Him.